I'm Sally Brew, and I'm president of Squaw Valley Property Owners Association, and we are the ones who are putting this on tonight. I want to say that the Squaw Valley Property Owners Association is the oldest organization in the valley. It's been here since the Olympics, and we do all kinds of different activities, which I won't go into at this point. But I was approached by Dale Cox in January, and Dale said that he would like to share his experience in the tram accident. So there were many heroes of that night, and so some of them I'm sure are here in the audience that maybe we'll have a chance for them to say something later. I don't know about that. But we have a panel of Ken, and I think their names, yes, are up here. Ken, Bobby, Larry, Dean, and Dale, and they all agreed to share their experience. And what we wanted to capture is what happened in the lower tram and what happened in the upper tram, and then what were the rescuers on the lot who were outside on the hill, what they were doing. So so that's what we're going to do. And we're starting off with Dean Hall, who was in the lower tram, and he will share with you what that was like. And then the upper tram, and then we have the three rescuers who are, and you can see their names here, is Bob Carter and Larry Lawrence and Ken Volz. And they were up on the hill getting people down from the tram over to the Gold Coast to get them down to the bottom. So we hope we get kind of a broad picture here. So with that, and the panel agreed that Dean should start first because that's kind of the lower tram, and then we would go up to the rescuers, then last Dale will share. Dale was actually in the tram, and he has not really shared this story before, and he really wanted to share it with you tonight. So, without further ado, let me turn this over to you, Dean.
Howdy, my name is Dean Hall. I've grown up here most of my life, and at the time of the tram accident, I was actually an employee of Squaw Valley working in the parking lot directing traffic. Worked till about noon that day, and powder skied the rest of the afternoon. Dragged my friend out of the bar in the Chamois to go take the last run, because I think the accident happened around 3:45, which I think was the last tram. In fact, we missed the elevator, ran up the back of the stairs, and caught that last tram. So I'll tell you a little bit about the bottom car, only because it was a lot less tragedy, and my story will be about more thanking all the heroes of the night and everybody. That we have a small, great community here. We stuck together, and I think the rescue team was within an hour to the top of the car, which is pretty impressive out of some of the guys that were lift operators and cat drivers and volunteer firemen, and everybody came from a different path to help our community out here. So I'll tell you my story about the lower car. Again, about 3:45 in the afternoon, we caught the last tram, and we're looking out the back window. I drug my friend out of the Chamois. We both had our beers in our hand. We're going to take that one last run. And watching out the back, you could barely see because it was a very, very snowy afternoon. And all of a sudden the car stops, and you see this cable, and you hear this whoop, 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 whoop that went through the air, and you're like, what? And all the car tipped from side. All the skis piled on one end of the car, and then all the people piled with the skis, and then it swung the other way. So there was this big shift of a couple, 2 or 3 times, shifting back and forth with people and skis, and it was unbelievable. Luckily, no one was hurt too bad. A few stitches and a few bruises and bangs. Most of us were dressed fairly warm because we were going up. And again, I think it was the last tram. I don't know 100%, but most of us were going skiing. So dressed appropriately. Needless to say, we're hanging there now for a little while. The radios were less than perfect then, before cell phones and everything else, so we didn't know exactly what was going on. We knew that there had been an accident. The tram was stuck for a little while, and just to hold tight. So we did. After a while, we were told that it wasn't going to run, and that we should be prepared to evacuate the tram. How? No one knew right at the start that there was a cable and a winch with a ladder that went to the top of the tram with a hole in the bottom of the tram that you could exit through, which was an ingenious safety device, and it saved everybody there from spending the day or so, or the night or so, up there. We hooked up this, the directions were all in German or Swiss, and so no one could understand, no one could read them. Luckily for some good pictures, and it was, there was a Goofy and a few other people. I don't know all the people that were in it. At that time I was 19 years old, again, working in the parking lot as a ski bum. So we figured out how to run this thing with a few guys that had mechanical abilities, and we got right down to business and figured how this thing was going to go, and that we were going to start lowering people down in the tram. We started with a 12-year-old, give or take a little bit, boy, after assembling this thing and trying to figure out how it goes, and again, pretty self-explanatory and a very nice setup. We lowered this young man down, and the first thing, he just went down, and I remember Goofy, I think it was at the time, just twisting the knob of the hydraulic knob as fast as he could, and this cable slowly started to slow down. We're like, because he was falling like a stone. And keep in mind, we were in the middle of the gnarliest snowstorm, best powder day of the year for sure. And we couldn't see anything below except for lights, not even just dull lights through. So this young man went into the abyss, just gone. And I'm sure he was worried. But he was ready to go. He volunteered. So after I think we sent a young girl down, and that was pretty smoothly. And we drew names in a hat. Can't remember the exact total at this moment, but I think it was about 60-something people. Yeah. So we drew names in the hat. Fortunately for me, I drew 5. And there was a young man, I don't know, maybe 16 or 17 years old, and he was maybe even 15 years old, but he was beside himself. He drew almost last. So I said, here you go, here's my number. We swapped, and I decided I would stay until we could help. I had a little bit of mechanical ability, so I helped people in and out, and with the radio contact, we got new radios brought up to us in the night. It was a long, lengthy, I think it was about 20 minutes or so per person, and again, with very good help from the mountain and directions, and again, we couldn't see anything, and they could tell when they could see the people below, and so we could radio up, and then eventually they send us up drinks, and so this was, again, a lengthy process, and a little bit scary because you still didn't see anything. You were still dropping people down, and we knew they were getting down safely because you could hear on the radios, okay, next up, they'd have to stop, and they'd fill the big diaper thing full of snow because it would sway so much that we couldn't wind it up. So it took a little bit to learn that process. So as the numbers, we kept sending people, and it went pretty smoothly through the night. And again, I think all the heroes of the night, these guys are going to tell you more about them, but everybody, man, I'll tell you, they were right on, and people were so good, and this was methodically thought out, and again, we had no tragedies, so it was just a time-consuming process, and but scary, for sure. And finally, it was my turn to go down about 2 o'clock in the morning, maybe something like that. I think I got down to the old gondola building about 2:30. And at that time is when I heard what had happened to the upper cars, because they weren't telling us anything. So I remember going down in this diaper. You leave the tram, and you look up and you could see the people, and it was the last you saw of anybody, because I think it was right around 450 feet. Somebody might know the exact numbers, but there was marks on the cable in meters, and that's what we kind of went by. And we could tell, we would count the marks to the night, and you could tell that they were getting to the bottom. So it was my turn to go, and I remember looking up, seeing the people leave. You see the bottom of the tram, and the people looking down at you, and then you go in again into bliss, where you saw nothing, just blowing back and forth and blowing and windy, and all of a sudden you see hundreds of flashlights at the bottom, and you knew that you were going to be okay. But it was pretty scary, and I think it was all the ski patrol that were at the bottom of the hill, and I'm sure volunteers from the neighborhood and whoever was there came out and helped. And again, most of you that live here and have been part of this awesome community for so long, you'll know that we all stick together. We may have different political thinking, but we all stick together as a community, and this is one of the times that I can always remember seeing those lights, and I knew it was going to be okay. Anyway, I'll let the next person go on here.
So, can you imagine swinging there, going down 400 feet with the wind blowing, the snow and so forth, and just not aware of what was going to happen to you? But as Dean said, once they got down, it was very well organized. They got them over to the lodge and took care of them. But it took a long time. I wonder what happened to that 12-year-old boy, if he's still around to remember.
He wanted out. I know. I'll go.
Yeah. Okay, so next we have Ken, who was one of the rescuers on top. So it's a whole different situation where he was up on top. Okay, on to you.
Hello, my name's Ken Volz, and the story, or my experience with this whole thing, Bobby Carter and I were sitting at the Chamois and just heard this loud thud. It felt like an earthquake. It was the counterweight of the tram hitting the ground. And we could see the green car where Dean was just swinging out of control. And like he said, the cables were making just like a guitar string sound. They were just twanging and flying all over the place. At that point, Bobby and I both had been ski patrolmen here. We realized that there was going to be a rescue happening. We went across, there was a Sprite parked over at the bottom. We took that, went to the patrol shack, gathered up as much evac ropes, climbing gear, and put a duffel bag of first aid equipment and some blankets together and took that Sprite to the top. We pulled through the yard. At that time, we were both working for the grooming crew. We dropped Bobby off at the shop. He got 3,700, so he would be able to plow a road if we knew it was probably going to be necessary. We didn't really know quite what had happened yet. I took the Sprite to the top of the tram building and just ran inside to assess what was going on, if the cables were intact or if that was shredded up there or just what was going on, right? I encountered my first casualty right there. There was a lady who had been waiting for the tram. If you recall, there was that steel grate and there were some steel steps that were right there. When the thing went out of control, she just ran for her life, basically, and fell down those stairs and broke her ankle. And so that was my first task right there, as I splinted the lady, took her out, got her in the Sprite, took her back to Gold Coast, dropped her off, and then I went back to where the trail was being established. I think Larry and Bridwell and Rick Sylvester, Jimmy Mott, Chris Phillips, a lot of people had been across the trail already. So I left the Sprite and followed their path and helped begin fixing ropes. Where the tram car was, it was just past the second tower, so it was kind of a steep side hill there. So ropes were being fixed down there. And I believe Jim Bridwell and Rick Sylvester, Malcolm Jolly, those guys were down below doing that. And so we established the rope line from where the tractor was going to pick up people down to where that traverse began. Then the next event was just to get equipment over there. There was Akis, those rescue sleds, and I myself had a Stokes litter, which is like a basket. You've seen it before, you carry victims in. So we started getting equipment over to the site. We were bringing blankets, and once we realized that the first trip across, we realized that everyone was in city clothes. They were just in polyester suits and stuff. So we realized we had a problem. They were all dying of frostbite up there. So as we would bring them out, the first group, we would wrap blankets in, and we'd carry them across this traverse and drop them off where the tractor took them to Gold Coast, where I believe Denny Ches was in charge right there. They had made an emergency room set up in the restaurant. We began hauling firewood back because the people were frozen totally. So we began, someone got a fire going there, and we just kept feeding wood. So either you were carrying a person across back up this fairly steep trail, or you were carrying firewood back the other way. And that went on for the whole night, and it was pretty hideous conditions. When I finally got out, it was somewhere 1:30 or so in the morning. It took a good half hour before I could unzip my coat. I had rime that went from my face down the front, probably 1.5 to 2 inches thick. We had just iced over. We spent the whole night out there. And probably one of the more amazing things was one of my first trips across. There was a fellow walking there, and I think Larry encountered the same fellow, right? We're going, "Where'd you come from?" He just pointed up. He got tossed out of the tram, right? He was fine. we're just like, wow, okay. Yeah, and so, anyway, that was basically my experience, was we were just carrying people all night long. It was a fairly difficult task. So without taking up anybody else's time, I'll continue on to the next guy.
So thank you, Ken. And now we have Bobby, who's going to also tell you about, the two of them were up there together, and what his role was in this terrible, terrible night.
Thanks, Sally. Hi, I'm Bobby Carter. At the time, Kenny and I were ski patrol earlier years, and at the time we were groomers, and we were waiting to go to work that night in the Chamois, getting tuned up to go to work. Anyways, that's when we heard, like Kenny said, we heard the counterweight drop, and the twang of the cable was just unbelievable sound. I could not believe the sound that it made. And Kenny and I looked at each other and knew something was up, and we needed to get into action right away. So we hopped in that Sprite and drove up the hill and started grabbing ropes and, like he said, rescue gear, and headed up he took me to the shop, because we knew we were going to need a road to get up to where we could get people back to the gondola. And I believe they set up a mini hospital at the top of the gondola, and Denny Ches and Charlie Killemeyer, I think, were the two doctors that were in charge of the mini hospital that they set up there. But anyways, my role was to get this road to the top of Broken Arrow. And my first route was to go around Tower 16, and we could see that was not going to work. It was way too steep and too much snow, and there was no way I could get the road there. So I backtracked and checked out where now, I guess, their land bridge goes. There was a much less steep way to get up, and there was a lot of snow, and it was a whiteout. So I kind of didn't know. I kind of had a pretty good idea where I was, but it was kind of hit and miss. But I ended up getting a road up to the top of Broken Arrow there, where we could connect, where the rescuers with the ropes could meet me with the cat. And I remembered the whole night I was hauling people from the top of Broken Arrow back to the mini hospital at the top of the gondola. And that was pretty much my task. I was lucky I wasn't frozen like Kenny and these other rescuers, and Larry, and many other people that are probably in this room tonight that were on the rescue helping us. It's amazing how this community does come together, and when something tragic like this does happen, everybody comes together and helps one another get it done. And, so that was my experience, is hauling back and forth. I don't know how many trips I did, but many, many trips back and forth. And I think one of the last trips was the rescuers themselves, the frozen rescuers, trying to thaw them out. And when I finally got back to the top of the gondola, we gotten everybody across from Broken Arrow Ridge to the gondola. There was a Sprite just sitting there idling with nobody around. And I looked around, I was the last person there, so I went over and turned the Sprite off and then drove down the mountain. But yeah, it's amazing how people come together and do what needs to be done to get this rescue happening. So, Larry and I and Kenny were all firemen, volunteer firemen for the Squaw Valley Fire Department, as well as Dale. And, but at the time, we all had different roles and we were in different positions, and so that's what happened, my side of it. I was in a nice warm tractor all night, but I'm sure it helped get the people where we needed to get them. So with that, I'm going to let Larry.
Well, many of you know me, Larry Lawrence. I was a volunteer fireman, and I was down in the valley. Actually, it was up at my house up on Sandy Way, and the alarm went off, the plectron. We had about, I want to say, 8 or 9 volunteer firemen at that time, of which 4 of us are here right now. There may be a few more in the room, but Arnie Allen, Cliff Johnson, his brother Art, and Bob Ferris, and the 4 of us were the volunteer fire department, and we got called out on all sorts of rescues. And so I was called out as a fireman, so I naturally threw on my fireman's outfit coming out of my house, not knowing what the call was, but where I was supposed to report. And my wife was the dispatcher. And so I went down there. She had a beauty shop down at the valley, down there by the Chamois. And I went in there to get my ski stuff that I put underneath my fireman's outfit. So I want to say I probably had 15 or 20 pounds of clothing on. And I reported to where we were supposed to report. And I was on I think it's a 5 or 6 passenger. What do you call that, Kenny, that vehicle that takes the people?
A troop carrier.
Yeah, troop carrier, okay. So there was 5 or 6 of us that went up, and I believe Charlie Killemeyer was in that, myself, I can't remember everybody. I think Jim Mott rode up in there because nothing was moving up the hill. All the lifts were shut down, everything was closed down. And so we got up to the top of the Gold Coast, and then I took off with Charlie and Jim and probably a few other people, and we started walking in the deep snow all the way to the top of Broken Arrow. And then, to tell you exactly where things were, the upper car was probably a couple of 100 yards to the west of the last tower over the Silverado Bowl. And so we got to the top of Broken Arrow. In those days, there were a lot of trees in Broken Arrow Canyon. And so we had to make a trail, pack a foot trail, a single trail, not on skis, on foot, to go across where this car was. And so while Kenny and all those guys and Rick Sylvester and so many people were setting up the rope lines, we were some of the first to get over the car. And Dale will tell most of the story, but there were approximately 45 people in the car. So it took a long, long time to get everybody out of there. And when Bob talked about the guy that we saw walking up the hill, I actually knew who he was. And I tried to look it up online today, I couldn't find it, but he was an airline pilot. He flew for Delta or United, one of those airlines, and he had done some miraculous rescue of saving a plane over Michigan back in the 70s. And when he got either thrown out or exited out of the car on his own when it was bouncing up and down, he was thrown down the slope. There's a slope up there that comes off the tower that goes down towards Silverado, that ridge. He was thrown down that ridge, and he opened his arms and legs up, what he told me, and he landed like an airplane. And he didn't get hurt. So that was just an amazing story. But My role was strictly rescuer, going back and forth, up and down, from Broken Arrow, down, back up again, eating snow to stay hydrated, no food. We got up there probably about 4:15 or 4:30 by the time I got over here. I think Dale said the first people came about 45 minutes. And the entire night from 4, I'm thinking about it. Let me take a break. I'm thinking about the little girl that I carried out of there, who lost her parents. Anyway, sorry. We carried the people up and down. It was hard, it was tenuous, it was high, deep snow. I want to say by this time the storm had gotten stronger, and it probably got up to hurricane, category 2 hurricane winds, and you couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And the little girl came off the car, and I opened my jackets and put her inside, and she was 4 or 5 years old, and I walked her out, and I didn't know until this week that it was her parents that died up there. So that's why I'm so emotional, sorry. Anyway, this effort that all the rescuers put on, we had ski patrol, we had ski instructors, we had volunteer firemen, we had other people that were busting their butts up there to help all these people that were just in this freezing car. And I think the coordination was excellent. The teams worked together great. I commend all the people that helped up there. If any of you are in the room, I think you did a great job. And the one thing I wanted to say is that the amount of energy that I'd exerted was way more than the day I tried out for the Navy SEALs. I mean, this was unbelievable up there. You had to hike uphill with the people in a trail, in the dark, we can't see. And the guys that were rescuers who were coming down with firewood and blankets would step aside off the trail. It was very steep. We were on the west side of the ridge between Broken Arrow and the tower. So they'd step aside, you'd be bringing the people up. And this went on. I think I was one of the last people off the mountain, and it was around 2 a.m. And so for almost 8 hours, up, down, up, down. And we lost some of the ski patrolmen and some of the ski instructors. We had to bring them out because they get up at 5:30, 6 o'clock in the morning, go out and do avalanche control, and they're out there all day and maybe didn't have lunch. They got dehydrated. So not only do we have to bring out some of the people that were injured or in the car, we had to bring out some of the rescuers as well. So when I came down the mountain, I'll let Dale tell you a little bit about that, but when I came down the mountain at 2 o'clock or 2:30 in the morning, wherever it was, after being in the dark for almost 8 hours, all the media was down. It was like the middle of 4th of July with the lights and the cameras and everything else. And I just tried to get through it and go home. So that's my story. Dale's next.
Thank you so much, Larry. And I think Dale has something to say about the 5-year-old also as a little bit of a follow-up. But you can see how traumatic all this experience really was for the people involved in all cases, rather in the tram or as a rescuer. So Dale was the person that approached me about doing this, presenting this. And Dale says the first time he's really shared this experience because he was actually there in the tram. So with that, let me turn it over to Dale. Okay?
This is all happening just a little bit too fast, but I'm going to get through it. Just a little follow-up here, like Sally mentioned. Little did I know that there is a blog. If you go online and you go to Squaw Valley Tram disaster, there will be a blog. And this is a communications network that people that were either interested in the accident or were victims of the accident could communicate. And I got a call about 3 or 4 months ago from one of my lady friends that flew out here from Michigan to have a party with me. it was my 31st birthday, and I had several people that we were partying with. But Gail called me from Michigan, and she says, Dale, she says, have you heard about the blog online? And I said, no. And she says, well, let me tell you that Deanna Wensnewski, who lost her parents in the accident, has been on this blog, and she's searching for other people that were on the car or had to do with the rescue, so that she could figure out exactly what happened to her parents. And so basically, Gail had been in contact with Deanna. She's 40 years old plus, lives in Virginia, and has a couple of children of her own. And she actually was going to be here with Gail, but there were some circumstances that would not allow her to be here. But she was very, very emphatic about having a copy of this video that's being shot here tonight. So she's in touch, and she knows what's going on. But one of the things that I found very interesting after 38 years, and I'm sure a lot of you people out there can relate to this, is that nobody really got the straight story. Nobody really knew exactly what happened. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the survivors in the second car, there was only two of us, Dan Katowski, the operator, and myself. And whenever any of the media showed up to get any kind of a statement, I know I left because I didn't want to say anything to the media, because I wanted this whole experience to go away. Dan, the operator, wanted to keep his job. The only other people that had anything to say about it were people that were all on the negative about this situation. And a lot of the people that were in the press, and I've got every article that's ever been written about that accident, a lot of people weren't even there, but they had a whole lot to say. And everything that they had to say was vindictive, and it was calculating, and it was taking shots at Alex Cushing and his Squaw Valley Ski Corporation, which was very unfair. And so basically what happened is the media put their own spin on this, and nobody really got the straight scoop until Bob Froelich, about 15 years later, put together and had cooperation from some of the survivors and some of the ski patrol people, and Charlie Killemeyer, of course, and put together a story, and it kind of put together the real happening of what happened. Now tonight, this afternoon, I was very surprised to meet a lady that ventured here from Phoenix, Arizona. Please stand. She's here from Phoenix, Arizona, because she wanted to hear the straight scoop. She's only heard what people have wanted her to hear, and like I say, most of it was negative. So, you're going to get the straight scoop, lady, if I can get through it. To give a little bit of background, this was my 31st birthday. I had 6 people from Marin County and an Afro-American chauffeur driver that never had seen snow. And we had a real raging party at the River Ranch, which most everybody was there. the night before. And we all got together and we were gonna go up to the top of the tram for an afternoon Bloody Mary. So the morning was overcast, drizzly, and fairly warm. It was maybe 40 degrees. I dressed in a Levi jacket and a t-shirt with Levi pants and not dressed for skiing or anything like that because we were just going up and doing sightseeing as a favor to my guests from Marin County. And we were got up at high camp, started having cocktails, and all my friends were electric. They just brought in people, and we ended up with the whole upper terminal with people that were skiers and people that wanted to party with us. And we were all sitting up there having cocktails, except for me. And all of a sudden we're sitting back and we're watching the wind start to pick up. And the wind continued to get worse and worse and worse. And we're sitting there and we're in this big glass enclosure right underneath the tram bay. And we're noticing the tram car coming in to the upper terminal. And the wind was blowing so hard that the tram car was cocked off to the point where it couldn't get entry into the girders that guided it into the upper terminal. And we're all sitting there with my friends looking at that tram car just hanging out there in the wind. And we're saying, you know what? It's time for us to leave. So we all got up. The tram car came into the girders and came into the upper terminal. And we all got up and started up the stairwell. And one of the passengers that got off the tram, we met him in the stairwell, and he said, if you guys get on that tram, you're crazy. And I've been up and down that tram, I can't tell you how many times. In wind, I can't tell you how intense. And I've always gotten on that tram and been confident that I was going to get off on the other end. And this trip just wasn't to be. So my 6 friends and the chauffeur were standing next to me, and like an idiot, follow me. And we all got up, boarded the train, along with a bunch of other tourists that were sitting with us having our party. As soon as that tram left the upper terminal, we got hit with a blast of wind that kicked that car to the north. And it was an intense enough blast that everybody that was just kind of standing there all went over and started grabbing on to the grab rails that went all the way around the car. And we're holding on to the grab rails, and I'm holding on to a support rod. And the further we got out of the terminal, all of a sudden, there was no vision. Everything was a whiteout. Now, I don't know if anybody has ever experienced vertigo, but vertigo is where your senses, you lose track of what's up and what's down, and you become very confused. And what happened is that my senses became very intense on what was happening inside the car. And as we continued further down the line, the further we got out into the system, the harder the wind blew. And all of a sudden, we're sitting back and all the passengers are clinging to these grab bars that go all the way around the cabin, and I'm holding on to one of the support rods. And I'm thinking to myself what I'm feeling. In all the times that I've ever ridden up and down that tram, I've always felt my feet feeling the wheels going along the cables, and I could feel that security that the tram was operating in a total normal manner, and it was going to be a safe trip. This time was different because the vibration and the feeling that you got in your feet let you know that that cabin was not resting on the track cables the way it normally would. And the further we went down the system, the cabin started going up and down and going to the side, and it would get blasted by a gust of wind, and it would really pitch the car to where you couldn't stand on the floor without holding onto a grab rail. And it get pounded and pounded and pounded, and we kept getting further and further out. And my 6 friends and the Afro-American sat back and were looking at me, saying, Dale, to themselves, Dale, are we all right? And all of a sudden, the guy standing next to me went, yee-haw, riding cowboy. And I thought to myself, this is it. I know Dan very well. He's the operator. We're going back. And I turned to him, and I looked at him, and he took his jacket and grabbed a hold of his sleeve like that and made a pass on the window to be able to see where the tower was. And I took a step towards him, and the floor disappeared. It just was not there. Everybody was holding on to the side, and I was starting to make passage to the operator to say, we're going back. I didn't have any idea where we were on the system, but we were not going to go any further. When that tram floor dropped, I went head first about 50 feet in a vertical position with my hands out in front of me. And you'd think that if you fell 50 feet and hit a floor, that you'd hit hard. Totally not the case. Because what happened is all of the passengers were all falling at the same time. We were all very close to the ceiling. And what happened is we caught up with the tram car in its vertical descent, if that makes any sense. So we caught up with the tram car. The experience of being smashed or hitting really hard on the floor didn't happen. We caught up with the floor, and then it started. And most everybody was either sitting on their fannies or were on their hands and knees. And everybody was scrambling to get to their feet. And what happened after the tram car reached the bottom of its descent, it started catapulting upward, and the tram car started this incredible vibration that you cannot imagine anything that big would vibrate that intense, where the whole inside of the cabin was a blur, and all the passengers were clearly visible and, under no motion at all. The cabin was going back and forth in a horizontal position between 3 and 5 feet. You could not focus on anything except the other passengers. And we were being catapulted in an upward vertical ascent. The cabin vibrating and gyrating intensely. And when we got to the top, we started back down again. And when we got to the top, there was this big bang on the roof of the car. And we fell back down probably 50, maybe 60 feet, maybe more. It was hard to tell. But once we reached the bottom, the whole thing started over again. The car started going back and forth at such a incredible vibration and incredible speed that everything turned to a blur except for the passengers. And we're on our way up for the second time, and all of a sudden, the windows on the control side and the doors blow out. And you could hear this crunch, and the glass blows out of the tram car, but as soon as it got out, it just all came back in with the wind back into the cabin. And now everybody is starting to really panic. And we reached the bottom of the second oscillation, and we started up for the third oscillation. The vibration and the harmonic in that car, once again, you couldn't see or make out anything other than the passengers. And the cable started coming through, pinning anything and everyone underneath it. And when the cable came through, I was on my hands and knees. I thought we were on the ground. So when the door blew out, I was pushing myself on my hands and knees towards the open door because the guy right next to me went out, and I was sure that we were on the ground. And there was our cocktail waitress, was right next to me, and both of us were pushing ourselves on our hands and knees to try and get out the open door. Well, about the time that I got pretty close to the door, the cable and the wreckage started coming down on me, and it pinned me right in front of the door. And the cocktail waitress that I was pushing to follow out was dangling out of the tram and had a hold of my leg. It hurt. She had a death grip on my leg. And I thought it was wreckage that was going against the soft tissue behind my knee. And I was sure if it broke through my Levi's and got into my flesh, that it could be a serious deal. So I reached down, and instead of grabbing wreckage, I grabbed her hand. And I realized it was her hand after she let go of my leg, and she worked her way up my arm and got back into the car. And then she stepped on me because she was in such a panic to get into the closed section of the car. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to show some pictures. And pictures are worth 1,000 words. And there's one thing that there's one thing I really appreciate. If nobody took pictures, I'm going to get through this wheezy. I don't want anybody to take pictures of what's going to be on this screen. It's very sensitive, to everybody here. It's very sensitive, for me especially. So please, please. Okay, Pete. Okay, this first picture is a very clear indication of exactly what happened. I hope you like my pointing here.
Bill, why don't you take the mic out of the holder and hold it in your hand?
Okay.
We will be able to hear you.
Help me out here, Pete. What we got here is this is the haul cable. It does exactly what it says it does. This is a track cable, which the tram rolls along. This is the area where this cable was supposed to be. As you can see, the cable goes over the surface of the cabin. It goes all the way down the hill, over top of the rock pile, or the nose of the rock pile, and down to the lower terminal. And then it goes from this part of the cabin all the way up to the top part of the terminal. And if you look at the cables that are supporting the carrier and the tram car, you can see the tension that is on this part of the cabin. This part of the floor. Now also you can see that the cabin was pulled down along these support rods, which is maybe 3 feet from the outside edge of the cabin. And what happened is this whole section of the roof came down, separating the right-hand side of the cabin, which is open air, and the left-hand side of the cabin, which was still pretty much intact. Next one, Pete. This picture here was taken a few days after the accident, so basically there's a few things that aren't really correct here. I was pinned right underneath that W, right in this section right here. This is the support cable, or the support rod that comes down. These are the support rods that come down. Those 4 rods hold the bottom of the cabin to the rest of the carrier. All of the fatalities were along this line. The last fatality was next to me underneath this W. And this door was not there. I think what happened is that it was dangling down and it was possibly in the way, but it was not there because this part of the floor was totally vacant, and this is where Dan Gutowski and myself and Frank Meager, who now lives in Paris, France, stood to pull the first rescuer up. Now, another interesting point is look at this stress fracture right here, and this stress fracture here, which shows you the incredible amount of pressure that's on that cabin floor. Of course, this is the rescue equipment. And I want you to really take note of the design of the floor of this tram car. To me, it never really gave it much thought, but that day, and I look back at this picture, the designers of that cabin designed an absolute perfect kite, because that tram car went off and was blown off the system. Next slide, Pete. This shows a real good idea of how the cable sliced through. That porthole right there, of course, is the roof access. You can see it's in a vertical position, separating the two cars, or separating the two sections of the car. This little section of wall right here that stayed intact was my lifesaver, okay? Because I like to call it my position after everything came to a halt. My position was right there on that cable, or on that support rod. And I don't know if anybody has ever experienced. That's fine, Pete, thank you. I don't know if anybody has ever experienced trying to stand up in 100-mile-an-hour wind. I can tell you that you can't do it. You can't do it. When the cable stopped and when everything came to a halt, it was so quiet you could hear a pin drop only for a couple of seconds. And at that time, the compression that I had on my back, I could only take these short little breaths because I couldn't expand my lungs, and I was seeing these big blotches of balloons that were red and blue and purple exploding in my vision, and I just kept trying to keep from losing consciousness, and I'm laying on the floor, and my face is on the deck, and all of a sudden, I see this face, these two big brown eyes and this great big nose is laying flat on the floor facing me, and it's the operator, and he says, "Dale, are you all right?" And I said, "I think so," and I was still trying to catch my breath. And my arms were compressed against my chest. And when I pulled my arms out, I could drop down into a little bit more space to be able to expand my lungs and to be able to get some oxygen flowing to my brain to keep from passing out. And I'm laying there, and the operator, Dan Gutowski, gets up, and people are screaming, and they're hollering, and they're, "Oh my God," and a lot of four-letter F words. And Dan says, "Everybody try to keep calm." Okay, it seems like you'd see something like this in a Poseidon or something like that. He says, "We're not going to fall." And I'm laying there, and I'm finally getting my senses around me, and I'm starting to be able to become a little more alert. I says, "What do you mean we're not going to fall?" I just couldn't believe what I was hearing. And he says, "Please be calm. Everybody, please be calm." And he's standing right next to me saying this. And I'm thinking to myself, we've got to be on the ground. So he comes back down, he faces me, he says, "Dale," he says, "can you get out?" I says, "Dan, you're going to have to get some of this stuff off me, and I think I can." So he's taking plexiglass and pieces of aluminum and sheeting from the sides of the cabin. throwing them overboard. And I start backing myself out, and I get my head to the cable, and I can't get my head underneath the cable. So I took my finger and I pushed my ear as hard as I could, and I started tucking my ear under the cable, and I finally could get my head out from underneath that cable in the wreckage. And I got to my feet, and the wind was blowing so hard that I had to hold on to one of those support rods in order to keep from getting knocked over. And I stood there for about a minute, getting my breath back so that I was not afraid of fainting. And so Dan and I are holding on to each other, and I'm holding on to the support rod to keep from being blown over. And large pieces of the sidewall are flapping in the wind. I mean, good-sized pieces are flapping in the wind like they were paper. And if you got anywhere near them, it was sharp and it was dangerous. And so Dan and I started our initial assessment of what was going on, where the injured were and so on. The first thing I did was I climbed over the wreckage into that vertical piece of roofing, and I opened up that hatch that goes to the top of the tram, and I looked through that big circle, and here's my 6 friends and the chauffeur all sitting there holding each other and just shaking like you couldn't believe. And I asked them, I says, is everybody okay? And they said, yeah. I says, are we all accounted for? And they said, yes. So I closed the hatch. Dan started working his way down the line, down the wreckage, assessing what was going on. And I worked my way from the center of the cabin to the uphill side, assessing what was going on. And after a few minutes, we met back, and Dan said, we've got 2 fatals on the very end down here. And I says, you know what? I said, we got somebody that is in grave danger right at our feet. And it was an Indian, not like an American Indian, but a regular Indian from India. And his wife were pinned right next to us. And we started sitting back, trying to figure out the first thing we learned as a volunteer fireman: stop the bleeding. So Dan went down one side, trying to help people stop the bleeding. I went up the upper part, and there was this Indian man who was pinned right next to me. The only way that you could get to him was to crawl under the wreckage and inch your way along, and he was visible from about the shoulders up. And there was a little bit of blood coming from around his hand. So I pulled his glove to see, if there was anything that I could help. And the top of his hand was split open like a very ripe tomato. No signs of trauma, no signs of any kind of scraping or anything like that. His skin had just given way at the back of his hand from what I thought was probably the pressure that his internals were under with being pinned. And so we come back up together after our assessment, and Chris Longigirkis the cocktail waitress, says, there's gotta be a first aid kit in here. And so Dan says, there is one, it's right in that compartment. And he gets out a piece of the wreckage that was sharp, and he carved out, because it was all covered with ice by this time, he picked up the hatch. And we looked in, and here's a first aid kit right on top. And Dan handed me that hatch cover, and I took it over to the side, and I threw it off the deck, and that 20-pound hatch cover blew away like a piece of tissue paper. And it was blowing so hard that you had to really struggle to stay on your feet. And after we got everybody calmed down, there was still a lot of people that were crying for help, you know, praying to God to help them and to save them. The man at my feet was just saying very quietly and very politely, please, somebody help me. Please, somebody help me. And I'm standing there, and at this time, I dropped down to one knee, because that part of the wreckage that I showed you that was vertical acted as a windbreak. And I took my hands, and I doubled my fists up, and I stuck them under my armpits, and I unbuttoned the top button of my Levi jacket, and I put my face down into my jacket, and I started breathing because I had to protect my face because the wind was cutting against my face so hard I could hardly breathe. So after we made our assessment, we started throwing out the debris. And the debris was a lot of skis, a lot of poles, a lot of glass, a lot of aluminum. There you go, thanks, Gene. A lot of stuff that was really getting in your way. And there was a gal that was standing with her skis, and she was just shaking like you couldn't imagine, just shaking. It's hard to even imitate. And I went up to her and I says, lady, give me your skis. I took her skis, she didn't want to let go of them. I took her skis and I kind of walked over to the side, and I pitched her skis and I pitched her poles. And all of a sudden, this woman went into a total hysteria. We're talking out of control, shaking, hands like this, and she's screaming the 4-letter F word at the top of her lungs. And she's screaming, and she's saying, my God, she says, I can't believe that this is happening to me. And she's shaking and she's screaming this 4-letter word. And I walked up to her and I grabbed her by her shoulders and I started shaking her. And I shook her as hard as I could. And her head bobbled around like a bobblehead. Her goggles came down, her scarf came down, and she was standing there looking at me, and she was going like this, totally in hysteria. And I got real close to her, and I says, listen, lady, I said, we're in big trouble, and you are not helping. And she finally started to get her composure, and she walked into the covered part of the car, and she sat down, put her head between her legs, and didn't move the rest of the night. Everybody started becoming a little bit acclimated to what kind of a predicament we were in. And of course, everybody that's in critical condition, the fatalities that are still alive are crying for help. And my friends, along with a few tourists, are over in one section, and they're all sitting on the floor with their back to the carnage, and they're singing Christmas carols. Because little Dina Wenszewski was with our group, and they were singing Christmas carols because her mother was still alive and was struggling for her life. Then, up a few feet apart, was another group of people. And they were singing religious songs and saying the Our Father. And I'm sitting there and I'm kneeling on one knee. The Indian lady has got a hold of my arm and she's holding me real tight and real close. And I'm trying to stay focused on not losing it. And the louder these people cried for help, the louder the Christmas carols got, the louder the praying got. And I'm kneeling there with this Indian woman, and all of a sudden, breaking the silence, this Indian man starts hollering, "Help me! Somebody please help me! Somebody please!" And it's right here. It's right here next to me, at my feet. The Indian woman shakes me, and she says, "Please help him. Please help him." So I crawled back under the wreckage, and if anything you would ever think of that was bad would get worse, this got worse, because he's now hemorrhaging profusely from the nose and mouth. And I'm laying on my stomach, and we're face to face, and he's choking. And what's the second thing we were taught at our fire department first aid class? What do you do if somebody's choking? You clear the airway. So I took these two fingers, I inserted them into his airway, and I started paddling, pulling out hemorrhage. The harder he choked and the harder he gagged, the faster I would clear his airway. Finally, he quit choking. And we were staring at each other face to face, and I said, "Listen," I said, "your wife is right here, she's fine." I says, "You have got to hang on. You have got to hang on a little while longer." And I talked with him a few minutes, and a few seconds actually, and tried to explain to him that rescue personnel were going to be here, and that he was going to be just fine. He wasn't choking. And I pushed myself back out from underneath the wreckage. I went over to my position on that support rod with that Indian woman. And I told her, I says, "You got to be strong, lady." I said, this whole thing is going to go on a little while, and you've got to be strong." And I feel kind of foolish at the time, because I really didn't realize that that Indian man didn't hear a word I said. So, we're all pretty much calm. Everybody's singing Christmas carols and praying. And Dan and I are watching for the first ground personnel to show up on the scene. As I said, we uncovered the first aid kit. Underneath the diaper was all the equipment, the spool of wire, and all the equipment to attach it to the superstructure. But all of that was gone, so we took the spool and we lowered the cable down to the ground and set the spool on the ground and just sat there and waited and waited. And at 40 minutes was the longest 40 minutes of my life. And we're sitting there, and all of a sudden, Dan says, "Here come our rescuers." And I kind of looked up, and you had to put your hand out here to break the wind, because not only was it windy, it was snowing really hard, and it was just like having your head in a sandblast. The snow and ice was hitting your body. The first two rescuers show up on snowshoes. They're standing at the bottom, and all of a sudden, the first rescuer on the ground says, "Pull up the rope." So Dan started pulling up. Sat back so that it wouldn't be a hazard. We got about a 5/8 mountaineering rope, nylon mountaineering rope. And the rescuer said, "Throw the rope over the top of the superstructure." That's this big pipe that goes around that everything attaches to. And we dropped the rope over the top of the superstructure and dropped the rope down to the ground. And the first rescuer tied the rope around him and took the excess slack from the opposite end of the rope, and they wrapped it around a tree. And Dan and I started hauling this ski patrolman up to the car. We got maybe 5 feet off the ground, and we had to let it back down. We just didn't have the horsepower. My friends, I said, "We need some help if we're going to get through this." The first person that came through the wreckage was the chauffeur driver. And he had a white handkerchief wrapped around his hand, and it was saturated with blood. And he said, "What do you want me to do?" I said, "You know what, Larry?" I said, "You can help any way you can, but this isn't going to work." I says, "Send out somebody else." So out comes one of my best friends, Frank Mahar. And the three of us started pulling up on that rope, standing on that flat section that I showed you in the picture. We hand over hand started pulling up the first rescuer. We could go with a cadence. We could go maybe 10, 15 feet, and then we had to stop and rest. And we pulled again 10, 15 feet, and we had to stop and rest. It took us about 5 minutes to pull the first rescuer up into the cabin. He had a radio, and he started radioing to the rest of the people on the ground of the severity of what was going on. And he started asking for heavy equipment, blankets, ropes, and a come along. A come along is a lifting tool that's used in heavy construction. So then the first rescuer starts doing his own assessment of what was going on, and a few more rescuers showed up on the ground, and Dan told me, he says, it's Jimmy Mott. He's going to have us down in no time. And I'll tell you, I have known Jimmy Mott for a long time. And it's not that I had my doubts, but Jimmy Mott never gave me the impression that he was a leader, that he was a doer, and that he was a person that could take command. So Jimmy tied himself onto the rope. Now Chris Phillips, the first rescuer, is a pretty good sized boy. He's very strong, and we had no problem pulling Jimmy up to the car. He gets into the car, and he looks at me, and he says, oh, geez, Dale. He says, we got a lot of work to do. And I says, let's get with it. And so Jimmy is on his radio, and all of a sudden a come-along shows up on the site. And Jimmy pulls up this come-along, and a couple of chokers, which are metal cables that are used for rigging and attaching the come-along. We rigged up the come-along to the top of the carrier, that big pipe that's very strong. And there was only one section of cable that was exposed that didn't have people under it. And we wrapped the chain and hooked it, and Chris Phillips and I started pulling that come-along. And we got it to tighten up, and then it wouldn't go any further. And Jimmy says, pull! And we got on that thing, and we pulled. And it would go just a little bit, and then it would go kabam! And when it slipped, it would send a shock wave through your feet, through the floor, that was very, very scary. And he said, again! And we would pull that thing, and it would snap and send that shock wave through the floor. And he'd say, again! And we'd pull that come-along handle, and it would slip, and it would send that shock wave through the floor. And by this time, all the people that were praying, all the people that were singing Christmas carols, they're up on their feet. And they're starting to panic. And I said, Jimmy, I says, this isn't going to do it. I says, you need a chain fall. I says, if we go any further doing what we're doing, I said, I'm leaving. And he had his goggles on and his mask, and he stared at me and he looked at me for a couple of seconds. And he knew what that meant. And I was serious. I was serious because I'd made it that far. I wasn't going to go down in a heap. So Jimmy got on the radio, called for a come-along or a chain fall, which is a heavy, heavy lifting tool. You'll see them in big commercial establishments that lift cars and stuff. So we started evacuating the passengers that were mobile. Most of them were kids. And I would take the kids and I'd walk them through the wreckage and I'd hand them to Dan. Dan would get them situated on the T-bar, and they would sit down on the edge of that platform on that tram car, and he would push them out. And the people on the ground would lower them down, okay? It was only about 110 feet, so it didn't take long to get to the ground. And that's the evacuation that started. And so I'm getting people to go over the wreckage, handing them to Dan. Dan's getting them situated, booting them off the bottom of the tram car, lowering them down. And the Indian lady next to me stops Chris Phillips, the first rescuer. She's pulling on him. She says, please, she says, my husband's not moving. My husband's not moving. And Chris dropped down on one knee next to us, and he says, lady, your husband's condition is grave. I thought, oh man, he's gone. And Chris went about his business, helping with the evacuation. And I told this lady, I says, you know what? I says, we gotta really be strong here. This is a situation that was bad, and I says, it's getting worse. And I got my face down into my jacket. By now, the whole front of my jacket is like cardboard, because exhaling into my chest cavity turned my whole jacket to cardboard, like ice. And my forehead was still exposed, and all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself, I've got to start thinking of number one, because I'm starting to become not delusional, but unsure of myself as a functioning human being. And so I said, we got to get through this, and we're going to get through it together. And like I say, when the rescuer told this Indian woman that her husband's situation was grave, she reached down she reached down and pulled the scarf off her husband and gave it to me. And I wrapped that scarf around my neck. And I couldn't have had a better thing happen. And my thought process, I wasn't even thinking clearly, but I was thinking to myself, my hands were like clubs. They were totally numb. The only thing that I could work was my thumbs. I crawled back under the wreckage, and I took that woman's husband's gloves, and I brought them up, and I was standing next to her, and I was using my thumbs and my teeth to try and get my hands inserted into those gloves, and I couldn't do it. And she saw me struggling. She took the gloves from me. She opened them up, and I stuffed my fist into those gloves. And I couldn't feel a thing. Couldn't feel anything in my fingers or hands. And we sat there, I on one knee, holding onto that support rod. We were clinging to each other. We were crying like little children. And the evacuation was still in progress. By this time, the women and children had pretty much all vacated. There was maybe a half a dozen men that crawled over. I was the last man off that car. And when Jimmy told me, he says, Dale, he said, you're out of here. I looked over, I see my good friend Charlie Killemeyer feverishly working on more than he could ever possibly have to deal with. Had his little headlight on, was working, trying to bandage people up, trying to do his things, trying to comfort the people that were really, really seriously injured and were basically on their way out. I was thinking to myself, man, Charlie, I hope you got some magic in that bag because these people need it. And so I got myself situated with a T-bar between my legs. I inched my way out off that platform, and the wind hit me. Now keep in mind that the wind is blowing steady at 100 miles an hour, and it is gusting to 125 plus. Oh my God. Okay. Once I got off the platform, started down, the further I got down, the wind was hitting my body, and it caused my route to go into this huge, huge circle. And as I was going in this circle, I was also spinning like a top. And I mean spinning really fast and really hard. Between spinning around like this and this huge circle that I was being blown, I just closed my eyes and I couldn't see a thing. And all of a sudden, I could start feeling warmth. There was a fire going, and I got picked up on one of my huge loops by, I believe it might have been Richie Rosa. And he stopped my circular movement, and I got passed over to Hans Stantiner. And between Hans Stantiner and Jean-Pierre Pascal, the ski school director, they got me loose from the T-bar because I had it around my arms like this, and they stood me in front of the fire, and I was so relieved to be away from that mess, but at the same time, the ice started melting in my jacket, and I said, you know, I gotta go. I gotta get out of here. So they took me over to this group of rescuers, and there was this trail that went all the way up the side of this ridge line, and it went into this white abyss. And I walked up to the rescuers, and they said, grab a hold of the rope. Don't let go of the rope. I said, listen. I says, I can't, I don't have any feelings in my hands. I can't feel the rope. I can't hold the rope. The rope, me holding onto the rope is out of the question. So one of the rescuers took my arm, stuffed the rope under my armpit, pushed my arm back in front of me, and two rescuers sandwiched me between both of them. And they said, all we're going to do is walk up this hill. And I said, okay, anything you say. And the only thing you have to do is put your right foot in front of your left. And so we started up this hill. The guy in front was saying, left, right, left, right, left, right. And I was sandwiched between these two rescuers, ski patrolmen. Come to find out, last week, Kenny Volz took my arm, tucked it underneath the rope, and started shouting the cadence. And we went up the side of that mountain like a caterpillar crawling up a cement wall. I just closed my eyes. I put no effort forward because I couldn't. And the only thing I did was put one foot in front of the other as they called the cadence. The snow was up to our armpits, so I just kept my arms close together like this, and the rescuers kept me between them. They walked me all the way up to the top of that ridge line. At the top of the ridge line, there's these two big headlights of a snowcat. And I walk up to the snowcat, and there are these wide tracks. And you got to climb over them in order to get into the cabin. And who's there waiting to help me into the cabin? Bob Carter, my good friend. Got into the cabin, and Bob and I always had something to say to each other. Always. He said, Dale, he says, how bad is it? I said, it's real bad. He says, I'm glad you're all right. He drove me. We didn't say another word. Although the radio was going, I could hear the communication going on, the radio chatter, all the people in the emergency facilities and everything that was going on. Drove me up to Gold Coast. I got off the cat. I walked in the door. I had a blanket around me that Hansi Steinheiner had given me at the campfire. I walked in the door, and who's there but Rocky Rudolph? Rocky Rudolph comes up to me. He says, come with me, Dale. We went way off in Gold Coast restaurant, off into a corner. I no sooner sat down, somebody brought over a cup of hot chocolate. I said, Rocky, I says, I can't drink the hot chocolate. I says, I can't feel my hands. He pulled off my gloves, and he started massaging my hands with both hands on one. And he'd go from one hand to the other hand, massaging my hands. People started gathering around the table. Rocky got up. Within a few seconds, everybody was gone. He came back, started massaging my hands, massaging both hands. We talked a little bit, but we both sat there and we cried like little children. And I wasn't crying because I was hurt. I was crying because I was so happy that I'd come so close to death that there's nothing can explain the feeling that you have when you know that you're with friends and that they're trying to help. And I'll tell you, the whole town turned out. Everyone in Olympic Valley were there helping. So after about a half an hour of Rocky massaging my hands, He said, Dale, he says, I want you to go down to the bottom. There'll be somebody there to take you to X-ray. So I rode the gondola down. What a horrifying ride that was. 100-mile-an-hour winds. I mean, phew. Got down to the lower terminal. People were there. They guided me over to Tau Truckee Medical Group. There was Charlie Goodman, our resident X-ray technician, X-ray doctor. He gave me a full set of X-rays, and he said, Dale, he says, I want you to go to the hospital tomorrow morning. He says, you might have some issues with your spleen. So I said, okay, I will. Yeah, sure. So I left the Tau Truckee Medical Group, and I walked over to the entrance of the Olympic House, all glass across the front. I looked out, and in front of the chamois was solid media. Every news channel, every network associate, there was the whole promenade in front of the chamois was lights, camera, and press. And I'm standing inside, and I say to myself, this is probably 1 o'clock in the morning. I said to myself, I can't go out there. I just can't go out there. I'm standing there, and I'm trying to figure out what I'm going to do. Who walks up? Larry Lawrence, in his fire department outfit. He says, Dale, he said, come on, I'll take you home. I said, wait a minute, Larry. I'm not going out there. Larry takes a blanket, grabs a hold of it with his left hand, puts it over my shoulders, makes a tent over my head with the rest of the blanket, and he says, come on, we're going. He opened the door, and we started down that walkway towards the parking lot. We no sooner got out the door, and I could see about 5 feet in front of me, there's 3 sets of feet that are all walking backwards, and the light is intense. And I can hear somebody saying, is this a survivor? Is this a survivor, sir? Talking with Larry. Larry never said a word. We walked all the way through the media, all the way out to the curb, went over to his car, got in the car, took me up to the house, and I was getting out of the car, and Larry said, hey, Dale, happy birthday. So I walked down to my house, little shack. I never felt so alone in all my life. I had this big knot in my stomach, a big knot in my throat, and I sat there till daybreak, working my hands. I was starting to get feeling back in my hands. So I picked up the phone, and I called my parents in Tampa, Florida. My mother answers the phone. She says, Dale, are you all right? I says, Mom, I'm fine. I said, how did you know? She said, we were just watching the Today Show on NBC. And we saw Larry Lawrence walking a survivor under the blanket. My mother knew that it was me. Okay? And we talked very shortly. My mother said, Dale, if you need to see a doctor, don't be shy. Go see a doctor. And she handed the phone over to my dad. My dad says, Dale, you got out with your life. Now what you have to worry about is the monkey. I didn't know what he meant. He says, Dale, he says, make friends with that monkey. So, I ended up spending the next several months pretty much a recluse. I didn't want to see anybody. I didn't want to go anywhere. The only thing I did is I went down to the fire station every morning for a cup of coffee. Because I could sit there and cry like a little infant, and nobody thought anything of it. It was very, very rewarding to be able to be with people and friends that could help you out in your time of need. A lot of people ask me, Dale, what did you come away with positive over that horrible night? What was the positive thing for you, if there could be any? And I can tell you that seeing a grown man weep is not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of compassion. And the second thing was I realized how important it was to have friends. I mean, real friends. Friends that support you in a time of need, help you when you are in need, and offer you support when you're in doubt. Friends are the most important thing that we can all have in life. And friends are the most important thing for me, like you and me. Now you know the rest of the story.
When I was asked by Dale last January that he wanted to tell his story he's never told before, never did I ever think it would be such a story. And even have me a little teary. So thank you. Thank you so much, all of you, for making this come alive. And thank you all for being here. I think we all have been enriched by what we've heard tonight. So thank you for being here, and thank you, this wonderful panel of people who rose to the need on that fateful night. So thank you for being here. Bye-bye.